calculation was 3 trillion, but we only had 1.4 of it within the monetary sector. So it means that 75% was outside the economy. They also mentioned that they would be able to track the funding and Naira circulating. They also mentioned that it would help to curb corruption. But as we all know, the 50 Naira wasn't included because Nigeria redesigned that in 2013 to mark our 50th anniversary. Also, the 100 Naira was not introduced because in 2014, we redesigned it to mark the Nigeria's amalgamation between northern and southern entities in 1914. So what do we expect? We know that before now, a number of us, have thoughts, and that is why we are looking at the topic. And I know some of us are thinking, will this redesign curb competition? Will it help to appreciate Naira? Will it help to reduce inflation that is 21.07%? How about the problem of oil theft? Will this help us? Will Nigeria now become the 5th producer like we were before? We know that recently we were termed the 7th because of our volume of 1.014 million barrels per day, which is below Angola's 1.051 million and Nigeria's 1.06 million barrels. So will this currency also give us hope for our reserve? Our reserve from beginning of the year has been dwindling below $40 billion. Will this redesign help us? How about aggregate demand? Some of us have complaints to say that this expiration, because CBN has stated that we would introduce it December 15, and by January 31, it will be out of circulation. So some people are worried that won't it reduce the currency in circulation, and by that we would have to worry about a cost push inflation and not a demand pull. So people are also concerned that is this Naira really what you and I should be excited about? And so we put all those thoughts together and thought, who do we reach out to? How do we bring this to our audience? And we reached out to Mr. Okoyemi Agbaje, who will be facilitating this session. I would quickly read out his profile to us so we can understand that we have the best hand in this place today to share with us what we should expect. So Mr. Okoyemi Agbaje founded RTC Advisory Services Limited, a leading strategy, policy, economy, and business advisory firm in 2004, after his successful career in banking and financial services. RTC has worked with leading institutions, including banks and financial institutions, multinationals, and conglomerates, state governments, federal governments, agencies and departments, and business all across different sectors, including payments, fintech, real estate technology, and communications, manufacturing, FMCGs, and multilateral institutions. Mr. Agbaje is currently an adjunct faculty of the Lagos Business School. He teaches and conducts research in strategy and business environment with focus on economy and business environment analysis and scenario planning, industry and competitive environments, policy and regulation, strategy development, execution organization, transformation, and leadership. He was previously the senior fellow in strategy and business environment, and later head of Department of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Lagos Business School until 2007. Mr. Agbaje was the director of Chemical and Allied Products PLC from 2009 to 2019, a company listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, trustee of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund from 2011 to 2019, and chairman of the Convention on Business Integrity. He served from 2019 to 2021 as executive secretary and CEO of the Ogun State Security Trust Fund. Mr. Agbaje's work experience includes serving as a legal officer in First Bank of Nigerian PLC from 1989 to 1990, before he joined GT Bank in November 1990, rising from a banking officer level to an assistant general manager by 1998. Mr. Agbaje left banking industry in June 2004 as an executive director. His banking sector experience covers consumer and private banking, commercial and corporate institution banking, financial institutions and correspondent banking, and retail and financial services. He also exercised supervisory purview over a capital market subsidiary of the bank and served as chief risk officer. Mr. Agbaje studied law at OAU, where he obtained LLB honors in civil law in 1985. He also attended the Nigerian Law School and was called to Nigerian Bar in 1986. He obtained a master's degree in law from the University of Lagos in 1989 and an MBA from IESC Business School, Spain in 1997. Mr. Agbaje also holds the Merit Award of the Igbobi College Boys High School, ICOBA, awarded in 2019 for professional excellence and the gathering of Africa's Best Award for Excellence in Consultancy Services presented in London, UK. Mr. Agbaje is also a member of a Global Strategic Management Society, United States of America, and served for 2 years as representative for Africa of the Strategy Practice Interest Group. So you all can see that Mr. Agbaje is actually a very good facilitator for us today. Before we welcome him, I want to share with us some housekeeping rules. So we know that you have a lot of questions. We know that you want to confirm what actually you and I should expect. So we don't delay because we expect it will be a 60 to 90 minute session. Please feel free to go to the chat box and type in your questions. We have our team there that will be noting the question before the question and answer starts. So without much further ado, let me welcome Mr. Kwemi Agbaje to take us through our expectation on the impact of this new BT that our CBN governor has told us will be launched on December 15. Mr. Agbaje, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Fumi, and good morning to all those of our friends and brothers and sisters in the audience. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with you all today. Let me share my screen so that we can journey through this presentation together. So impact of the currency redesign. My approach this morning is to talk just about 10 minutes on an overview of the economy so that we first establish our baselines. Where are we? I would have a few slides, but I'm going to just brisk through them. So I believe that you'll get the presentations after. So I can spend the bulk of my time focused on the question of the day. What is the impact that I think and my team think that the currency redesign exercise will have on the Nigerian economy? So like I said, I'll just do a quick run through of the global and Nigerian economy. The point of this slide is that cycles of recessions and lags are more common these days. The point of this slide is to show growth projected for 2022 and 2023 across the world. And what you would notice is that most economies' global output is declined from 6% in 2021 to 3.2 in 2022, 2.7 in 2023 projected. So we're seeing slowing growth globally and in major economies of the world. The other point here is that inflation is a major factor. If you look at the first column, July 2021, and then look at the last column, September 2022, you see the marked increase in inflation in virtually all economies across the world, including Nigeria. And of course, COVID is still there, the figures and all of that as a global factor. Oil prices are currently slightly below $100 per barrel. They used to be up to $120 per barrel. Nigeria is in a unique situation in which oil prices are high, but we're not recording the incomes because of oil theft, because of underinvestment, because of policy gaps and all of that. And of course, because of the oil subsidy and possibly the attendant abuse of the subsidy program, which has seen the cost of the exercise reach between 6 and 7 trillion every year. This graph is just to remind us that I spoke about cycles in relation to global growth at the beginning of my presentation, but there are also cycles in relation to oil prices. And what I plotted there is every time oil prices have gone below $50 per barrel in the last 10 years, and you can see that it's twice. If I extended it to 15 years, it would be 3 times. And so it seems like we should always expect every 5 years or every now and then a slump in oil prices below $50 per barrel. I think that everybody's familiar with the story around debts. We now have both an external debt and a local debt challenge. And we now know that, of course, debt service is now constituting the bulk of our budget resources and is now surpassed revenue figures. In terms of the 2022 budget, what is clear is that all of the indices virtually, except for oil price, have subperformed the budget parameters in terms of revenue, in terms of oil production, in terms of exchange rates, in terms of inflation target. And all of them, the indices are exceeding the targets in the budget. And in 2023, we have a proposed budget of 20 trillion, and most of it, of course, is deficit financing, because the estimated revenue that we can lay our hands on is just about half of that budget figure. We spoke about inflation, the trajectory of inflation in Nigeria. Fumi mentioned in our overview that we're now close to 21% inflation. And that remains a major factor for policy. Exchange rates is the other challenge. While we keep the official rate around $450, naira to the dollar, we know that on the parallel market, we've crossed 750 at the time we reached 900 plus, but now we're back to slightly under 800 naira to the dollar. A lot of volatility in exchange rates markets. And of course, the reserves as well, just around $38 billion of reserves, indicating that going into next year and the transition, we may have challenges. And certainly if we adopted a freer foreign exchange market, obviously the reserves may disappear. I look at growth. We see the 2 recessions we've had in the last 5 years. We see them in the quarterly dimensions, the 7 quarters of recession. We also see here, when you look at quarter-on-quarter GDP growth, that quarterly contractions are a more regular event. And we see here the GDP divided into oil sector and non-oil sector. The oil sector is red and the non-oil sector is green. And you can see that most times in recent quarters, oil sector growth has been negative. And the little growth we're getting has been from the non-oil sector. This is growth by sectors. And you can see a quick snapshot of how all the sectors did in second quarter. Oil, of course, and mining being the 2 red sectors there that are still in contraction. Most other economic sectors are producing some growth, except that the growth in many cases is marginal, between 1 and 2-3%. So growth is not strong enough. This is the structure of the economy. Some social data before I move into the subject of the day. High unemployment, high underemployment. We have some new poverty data just released from the NBS that show that 133 million Nigerians are now poor, about 63% of our population. And if you look at the figures on a regional basis, as you can see in my slide, some shocking figures. Northwest, 45 million people. Northeast, 20.5 million people. North Central, 20.2 million people. Amazing data around poverty, demonstrating perhaps why there's instability, where there's insurgency, where there's terrorism, and why we should expect crime and banditry and all of those occurrences to continue until this data around poverty is resolved. Meanwhile, population continues to grow. I have a summary here, and I'm not going to bother with it that much, of the policy challenges and policy gaps. Fuel subsidies, electric sector, oil sector, dependence, reduced foreign direct investment, the difficulty of achieving exchange rate convergence, insecurity and increasing food insecurity in the mix. And then we now have a difficult, a complex, complicated political transition. Where are we going? We know that any of these four gentlemen will be the next president of Nigeria, barring intervening events, some of which have catalogued their catastrophes. And we suspect that these are the factors that will determine who is likely of those four gentlemen to become the next president. Having said that, the social context is in a mess. As I've pointed out, near anarchy in many cases, large-scale emigration of our youth, the economic outlook, the story around the economic outlook we're projecting is that subject to the elections and the transition going well, we think that we will see the gradual resumption of growth and gradual macroeconomic stabilization over the medium term. That's the story. And in the longer term, we see three scenarios for Nigeria. We continue to waver as we have done for the last 8 years or more. We experience a period of sustained expansion if we get policy right and governance right and development right, and then a possibility for collapse. Which of the three we choose, of course, depends on the choices and the decisions we take. So, impact of the currency redesign. Now, so the first thing, as I think Fumi already mentioned, Mr. Emefiele spoke on October 26 about management of banknotes, currency in circulation, particularly currency outside the banking system, relying on the powers of the CBN over currency management in those sections quoted. He announced that the bank had sought and obtained approval of the president to redesign, produce, release, and circulate new 200, 500, and 1,000 naira banknotes. And there's a window from December 15 to January 31st for exchange of those notes for some period running concurrently, and thereafter the closure of the exchange of old notes, January 31st. So a period of 6 weeks to complete the exercise. So I have some preliminary comments. The first one, and that's why I insisted on doing that overview of where the economy is right now. And when you see the picture of the policy priorities, of the challenges that we face in the economy, significant fiscal challenges, significant economic challenges, investment challenges, all of those revenue issues, it's difficult to see how currency redesign emerged as a monetary and economic policy priority. I remembered, as I thought about this, a joke by a comedian in one of the events I recently attended, in which he joked, and the joke fitted this: sometimes you can't fit the priorities of government to the challenges and the imperatives and the concerns of the people. And this is a typical case in which a skeptic or a cynic may say we have leprosy, but we're focused on eradicating ringworm. The second preliminary comment is the apparent non-awareness or maybe even disagreement between the Minister of Finance and the central bank over the policy. There's no doubt that CBN has the prerogative over currency, and that prerogative is unquestionable, especially when coupled with approval of the presidency. But I think that the dispute reflected poorly on the matter of policy coordination between fiscal and monetary authorities, which has been a significant error or suboptimality in the policy process, especially in relation to finance and economy. So this highlighted that dissonance between the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities. And the question is, even though this is a prerogative of the CBN, is it conceivable that the currency redesign and the exchange process may have significant implications for fiscal policy and broader economic and government financial management, which is the prerogative of the Minister of Finance? If it does, then it highlights some of the suboptimality in economic policy and management that we're experiencing. My third preliminary comment is that whether you agree with the policy, the currency redesign or not, there might be a valid debate on the appropriateness or the adequacy of the 6-week period, December 15, 2022 to January 31, 2023, allowed for the entire exchange process. Given the size of the Nigerian economy, given the volume of currency purportedly outside bank vaults, and especially in comparison with the process in some other economies where currency redesign and exchange has happened. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this third issue later on and look at how some of the other places, the process they have followed in this process. Having said that, I then move to the substance of the rationale offered by the bank for the currency redesign. 1, hoarding of banknotes outside bank vaults. 2, worsening shortage of clean and fit notes. 3, ease and risk of currency counterfeiting, aided by advances in photographic and printing technology. 4, the global best practice by central banks to design new legal tender every 5 to 8 years, whereas the Naira has not been redesigned in 20 years. Let me make a point in relation to that. My analyst suggests that the last time we changed currency notes to polymer occurred in 2007 and 2009, which is like 15 and 30. We did in 2 batches, in 15 and 13 years ago. But perhaps the CBN does not count the polymer conversion as redesigned because it wasn't the design that was changed, it was the texture of the currency that was changed. To deepen CBN's drive to entrench a cashless economy and support the e-Naira program of the CBN, security considerations in relation to kidnapping and terrorism vis-a-vis cash outside banks being used for ransom payments. Now, those were explicit justifications. There were some that may be more implicit, assumed, or conceivable considerations based on issues in the public domain. An attempt to curb political and electoral corruption in view of the proximity of the policy to the approaching 2023 general elections. While the CBN did not explicitly talk about this, other government officials, including the president and the chairman of the EFCC, have alluded to a corruption motive for this policy. Possible considerations related to the imperative of addressing rising inflation, which was alluded to slightly, which, as we have noted, has cost 21% as of October 2022. We add a possibility, and that's just a notional analyst addition, that if you do succeed in attracting significant deposits outside bank vaults into the banking system, it could improve banking system liquidity, it could contribute towards lowering interest rates conceivably, and it could improve credit to the economy. If the banks have more in their vaults, they could lend more to economic agents. And then we've heard a hope, I call that a hope, which has been recently verbalized by the EFCC chairman, that the currency redesign policy could lead towards lowering exchanges. So we have 10 rationale to examine, and we shall proceed to examine them one by one and provide our own opinion on each of those justifications. And then we would add additional considerations that we think may be relevant to the conversation. So the rationale, hoarding of banknotes. Validly, the CBN showed statistics that over 80%, indeed 85% of currency in circulation is outside the vaults of commercial banks. Out of 3.2 trillion naira, 2.73 is outside bank vaults in the economy. I have seen analysis that suggests that 2.7 trillion, though a large part of currency, is just 6.5% of total money supply. Remember, money supply includes indeed money in your current account or your savings account, money that you have access to, and therefore, in comparison with the UK, in which cash of money supply is 4%, and the US, where cash out of money supply is 10%. It's also difficult from a pure economic analyst point of view to argue that people are hoarding the naira, just from the point of view of a currency that is subject to both high currency depreciation and high inflation. It's not typical that such a currency will be hoarded. But the CBN has a point to the extent that the money is not in its vault, it doesn't know what is happening to them. So perhaps the currency has been changed into dollars, perhaps it's circulating, perhaps whatever. But it just doesn't strike you that a currency that is depreciating in value, both due to depreciation and inflation, will be subject of high rate of hoarding. Now, shortage of clean and fit notes, I dismiss that factor very easily because that's the CBN's responsibility. And I would argue that the easier solution to shortage of clean and fit notes is not to redesign currency, but to print new notes more regularly. The other point I notice is that if you are like me, if you go to the occasional Owambe, in any village in Southwest Nigeria, wherever it is, you know, you're saying Ibadan, any village, there will always be 2 or 3 gentlemen, touts with mint naira notes. So there's some suboptimality inside the central bank that is responsible for the shortage of clean and fit notes. So it would have to accept responsibility for that, especially because we know from CBN's data that it spends upwards of 50 billion naira every year printing the existing currency. So it's not as if there's a shortage of fit and clean notes. It is that they are being miscirculated through the autonomous economy of mint notes for party spraying that has now emerged. So the CBN will have to deal with that particular factor as its own responsibility. In terms of currency counterfeiting, my first statement, which is based on anecdotal evidence and common experience, is that it doesn't strike me as if we have an epidemic of currency counterfeiting. And I don't think we have seen incessant reports of such an epidemic. Data, however, supports, CBN's own data, by the way, supports the suggestion or the suspicion that we don't yet at least have an epidemic of currency of counterfeiting. So the CBN's data shows the pieces of counterfeit notes detected in 2019. This was the CBN currency report of 2020 and 2019 and 2020. You would notice that the figure dropped by 20% between 2019 and 2020 in terms of number of notes. In terms of value of notes, it dropped by 12%. And then there is a global standard in which you regard yourself as having a counterfeiting problem, 100 notes per million, more than that. And we're far below that. In those 2 years, there were 20 notes per million and 13 notes per million. So the data does not suggest that we have an epidemic or a crisis relating to counterfeiting. But again, it could be a proactive move in view of what the CBN spoke about, advances in photography and printing technology that could make us susceptible to counterfeiting in future. So that's currency counterfeiting. In terms of the position that it is global best practice to redesign currency within 5 to 8 years, that appears borne out by some quick sample of the data that we did. If you look at most of the countries in this sample, they have been within that horizon. I mean, except for the US, 9 years, but hey, that's close enough. And there's talk about redesign already in that economy. Most other places are fitting. The Euro economies are the ones in which they're far in excess of that 5 to 8 year horizon, but it is noteworthy that they're already commencing a new process of currency redesign. So that appears validated by the evidence. Cashless economy and e-naira. Obviously, this is one justification that seems aligned with the CBN's policy. We agree that withdrawing current banknotes may provide the CBN an opportunity, subject to additional policy prescriptions, to formulate and implement regulations and strategies for deepening the initiative towards cashless economy. The thing that may be out of sync, however, is that consideration on its own does not justify the emergency policy posture that the CBN appears to have adopted at this point in time, a time of political transition, a time of significant macroeconomic instability, and plus a time frame for implementation of 6 weeks just before elections. That suggests that there's some emergency, and I struggle to agree that it would be because of cashless economy and e-naira that we would take ourselves through that emergency. So it is difficult to situate the perceived urgency of this policy implementation within the context of cashless policy and e-naira. Security considerations, which the CBN governor mentioned, and which are a significant national consideration at this point in time. Actually, if from a purely analytical point of view, this begins to look like one of the stronger rationale for currency redesign. Widespread kidnapping for ransom, continuing terrorist activities of Boko Haram, ISWAP, so-called bandits and kidnapping and other gangs or groups of terrorists and insurrectionists has reached an emergency situation, admittedly, and it is not inconceivable. We may not be availed conversations within the security system, but it doesn't appear to me inconceivable that elements within the security system may consider a currency redesign as a viable strategy for destabilizing these groups due to their activities being mostly carried out in cash. Now, to justify that, however, you have to presume that these groups lack the network, the organization to successfully transmit their cash holdings through the banking system. I suspect that given the capabilities we've seen of many of these groups, that presumption may be debatable. We've seen that they probably have more regular citizens as their links with society, and they seem to be more properly described as organized crime networks. It does seem, based on current evidence and based on the inability of the security system to restrain their activities thus far, to assume that they have sufficient cloud network ingenuity to exchange their cash holdings for new banknotes, or to sidestep our currency in some regions of the country. For instance, we read that they're already turning to the French CFA currency to conduct their operations. In any event, while security considerations are not necessarily outside the purview of the central bank. I believe that the justification for a move such as this should be primarily economic. But we can understand that perhaps CBN is trying to play its role within the security establishment. Again, political and electoral corruption. It is noteworthy that while the central bank governor did not dwell on this factor, the EFCC chairman and the president have focused on corruption as a rationale for the policy context. And then the proximity of the policy to the approaching elections just the next month after the close of the currency exchange, and the 6 weeks deadline ending January 31st suggests that perhaps it may not be naive to assume there's a link with politics and with elections. Like I said, the EFCC chairman and the president's comments have validated that assumption. So the question, could the policy be an attempt to sniff out corrupt money from political office holders who have been in office for 4 years, and could it be inspired by these considerations? Or could it be an attempt to prevent or at least limit monetization of the 2023 elections? If these are the considerations, my instinct would be to say we want to pay a high price for that. But hey, it's not illegitimate to try to prevent monetization of the elections and to try to sniff out corrupt money from political office holders. On the other hand, I've read and I've heard more cynical people say that perhaps there was just an opportunity to award one last large contract for the regime and the bank itself. One writer in this day spoke of a funny country in relation to the currency change, where corrupt people often adopt the language of reform to confuse decision makers, donor agencies, and citizens. I don't have enough information on that, but obviously there are perceptions either way of the debate. Could it be to prevent corruption, or could it be an act of corruption itself? Inflation, that's one of the more rational, important considerations that is worthy of careful evaluation. Inflation has reached over 21%, so it's a legitimate national concern. And of course, the theory accepts that where there's too much money in circulation, it could conceivably fuel inflation. And therefore, if you reduce cash in circulation, you could moderate inflation. But we must remember also that money in bank vaults remain available for consumption. So if I move my money, my cash from my house into my current and savings accounts, or even fixed deposit, they're still available for me to consume from. And therefore, merely shifting the location from my house to my current account, to which I can simply do a transfer and buy whatever I want to buy, does not necessarily inhibit inflation. On the other hand, it has also been said that if you are holding illegitimate cash in large volumes and you don't want to go to the bank to exchange currency, it would make sense to look for alternate stores of value that hold value over time, such as, number one example, foreign currency, real estate, expensive cars, jewelry. These are all alternate stores of value, which you could presume you can reconvert to cash at a later date, after the exercise is concluded. If this is what behavioral economics suggests the typical person who has drug money or corruption money or any other type of illicit funds in his house, if that's what he resorts to doing, and if enough of such funds do that, it could actually fuel inflation. Already we have seen the consequences of such behavior in relation to the FX market. So it is possible also, and here I'm being deliberately cynical. I argue that if you want to fuel inflation and you're really concerned about inflation, some of the mechanisms that will cure inflation actually lie 100% within the purview of the central bank and would have maybe significant effect on inflation. Deficit financing of government, especially through ways and means, which is essentially printing currency, and subsidizing exchange rate purchases in markets with multiple exchange rates. These two factors may actually have a more significant impact on inflation. So while not dismissing the inflation rationale, what the point I'm making is that it could have counterintuitive consequences, and that there may be stronger policy mechanisms available to deal with inflation. Like I said, we added one concern. Yeah, if you succeed in drawing significant resources, 2.7 trillion into the banking system, that could improve banking system liquidity and enable increased credit to the economy, may also reduce interest rates. And of course, as a notional benefit to the economy, there's nothing you can argue about that, subject to the success of the exercise. The final rationale, which CBN has not explicitly advocated, but which the EFCC chairman has explicitly discussed, is what I describe as the fanciful notion that the currency redesign exercise could lead to lower exchange rates. Indeed, Abdulrashid Bawa of EFCC mentioned appreciation of the naira to 200 naira to the dollar. I believe it's a hope, a fanciful hope. I consider it unrealistic. Even if cash is drawn into the bank vaults, does it stop cash from chasing dollars from banks? Don't we all buy dollar from our bank accounts today? In any event, it's sufficient to say that developments in the first few weeks after the policy announcement has had a rather negative impact rather than a positive impact on exchange. But admittedly, we have not yet begun to draw in resources for cash into the bank. So I expect that the negative impact will moderate, the disequilibrium, the acute disequilibrium will moderate, and there'll be some increased stability in the exchange rate market. But I doubt that the policy could contribute towards appreciating our exchange rates. So that has been my evaluation of the 10 explicit and implicit rationale that has been offered for the policy by the CBN and in the public domain. I add 3 additional considerations. 1, macroeconomic instability. I believe that the policy, the process, and the timing adds another layer of uncertainty to a context of already unstable macroeconomic conditions, leading, as we have experienced, to higher currency volatility, lower economic productivity, policy distractions, and increased perceptions of risk and uncertainty. So it's difficult to see why you have such a vortex of all the challenges and of economic considerations that we spoke about earlier, and then you put another one into the mix, and you rush the process with little public sensitization, and you compress the process into a 6-week conversion period just before the country is going to go into elections that already bear hints of elevated political risk. So that's my first additional consideration. The second one is the process issues, and I call the process adopted an ambush process. A sudden announcement of a policy, a 6-week implementation horizon, which, as we have seen, is not consistent with global best practices. In the UK, a 2-year lead time for public sensitization and awareness was allowed, and the implementation was phased. In December last year, the European Central Bank announced the beginning of consideration and evaluation of new banknote designs, with a final decision in 2024. In the UK, old notes can be exchanged at any time after the process at the Bank of England and post offices, and then deposit money banks, the commercial banks, can still receive them as deposits, except that they cannot exchange them. And then they will return to the central bank. In some European nations, the deadline for you to exchange your old notes is up to 5 years. So it is a bit, well, since we agree to be embracing global best practices, it doesn't appear consistent with global best practices that we seek to establish this whole process in 6 weeks with zero consultation, and in the context of a less developed banking system and significant insecurity across the nation. I think I read somewhere that in Borno State, Yobe State, Adamawa State, how many bank branches are open? And how do we expect that process to be accomplished within 6 weeks? Those are valid considerations for policy. So these are policy process concerns. And my final point is around the cost of the currency production, the design, printing, circulation by the CBN and the banking system. The cost, there's no transparency around the cost, but we know that the CBN incurs upwards of 50 billion annually to print and circulate a fraction of existing banknotes. This involves printing the entirety of 200, 500, and 1,000 currency with design and other ancillary costs. So we think it is reasonable to project that the cost is likely to be multiples of the annual cost referred to above. So multiples of 50 billion or 60 billion. So there's, not knowing the cost, there's no basis in which we can correlate the benefits that are verifiable to the costs that that may be attached to the currency redesign. So I think you would already see where I lean. I leave the final decision on based on the criteria that we have discussed, based on the evaluation that we have made. My conclusions are that I am not personally, and my colleagues are not convinced that the case for currency redesign at this point in time has been borne out by the analysis. We believe, as I've said, that the policy adds to perceptions of macroeconomic risk and instability and elevated political risk. Many of the possible benefits are debatable at best, and the policy appears to have greater resonance as a political security and anti-corruption policy rather than a cogent economic prescription, in our view. The timing just before general elections and the 6-week time frame to complete the exercise also involves significant risk. It is difficult to see, as I conclude, how currency redesign gained priority as an emergency economic or monetary policy measure at this point in time. Thank you very much. I believe we are able to entertain questions. Back to you, Fumi.
Thank you so much, Mr. Agbaje. Thank you for the detailed explanation. I'm sure many of us also have noted some of the points Mr. Agbaje raised. I love the fact that he mentioned that part of the defense for CBN was shortage of clean and fit notes. I think that might be good news for the banks, because earlier in the year, CBN actually decided to penalize banks 400 naira for every 100 naira mutilated notes. They also mentioned that the mutilation is 6% in the economy. So really, is that percentage enough? Does it warrant us to go and print another set of notes? You also mentioned, sir, that this currency counterfeiting, it looks like there is no epidemic. I also haven't seen records showing that really we have huge people counterfeiting our notes. So that explains that, you know, it might not be a justifiable reason for us to redesign. You also mentioned security for kidnap. On the lighter note, you know, the kidnappers, or do I say that the media actually, when this currency was redesigned, came out to say, or maybe one of the, you know, legislators saying that the kidnappers would start collecting dollars. So even if we redesign Naira, even if we feel that the funds they have with them would be rendered useless, the threat is that new people will fund that expense. And so is it enough reason for us to redesign? You also spoke broadly about the inflation and, you know, particularly the budget. The budget, like you said, 20 trillion this year, 10 out of it, 10 trillion would be on deficit financing, so they will be borrowing. If you add that to the existing 42 billion that we have, we are looking at a 52 billion already for borrowing. For how long would Nigeria continue to borrow? So with this redesign, adding the cost as well that you mentioned, will it actually help us? It's looking like, you know, we are not sure, and it's not looking like. There was also the census analysis. So next year, again, being a pre-election, being the election here, they have also come out to say that they'll be spending 532 billion naira for census. So how does that really, you know, factor in the sensitivity of the 2023, which will be election year? There'll be so much money in the system. So that's also, we are not sure that it would actually help this currency. Then you introduce the macroeconomic instability. Thank you for the UK that you mentioned. Before this meeting, I'd also gone to read about, you know, such, and I found out that even the last one they did was just changing 20 and 50 pounds to polymer notes. And like you mentioned, even though the deadline is 30th September, you can, when you travel, you can take it to Bank of England to exchange it. The only thing is that you can't spend it, but you can exchange it. So which means that this our 6 weeks is a tight deadline. And if we are not careful, we might be putting ourselves on hot seat. In your conclusion also, I see that it's as if we might have more demerits than merits for this currency redesign that we are doing. So long and short, it looks like there's still so much I would say so much information that we can't really put together for us to conclude if it is a good action or not a good action, but everything speaks to it that is a negative decision at this time. So thank you so much, Mr. Agbaje. While it was going on, we had some questions. I'll quickly reel that out now. Thank you, Mr. Sheson Shubawale. The first question was from Mr. Sheson, and of course, he thanked you for the session, and he mentioned that it has been speculated that the decision and timing of this currency redesign is targeted at influencing the outcome of the 2023 elections. His question is, how likely is this speculation from an economic perspective? Over to you, Mr. Agbaje.
Thank you, Sheson. I think Sheson is my brother. Okay. I think that nobody would tell us that we have political objectives in designing this policy. But the context, like I said in my analysis, suggests that it's not just a coincidence that we have elections in February and we now want to change currency before it. And the currency redesign just emerged suddenly as an emergency policy prescription. and it must be done before elections, and it must be accomplished by the 31st of January. It suggests to the discerning mind that perhaps there is a link with the political calendar. Whether the motives are benign or the motives are actually positive, because, oh, hey, it is conceivable, like I asked, is it that I want to make sure, I want to leave a legacy of ensuring that money does not determine the outcome of elections? So perhaps I believe that some people have stashed billions of cash in their homes or in places known to them, and I want to demobilize such funds, perhaps. Or am I targeting the corrupt governors and office holders who have stashed funds in their homes, and we want to, EFCC, like EFCC says, we want to watch them closely, and as they try to launder the money into the system, we want to catch them. These are charitable explanations, but what appears real is that there appears to be a link with the political calendar. I will be very naive. Anybody will be very naive to say, no, it has nothing to do with the political calendar. It just so happens that CBN suddenly decided I wanted to do currency change, and it has to conclude before January 31st. So I won't use the word influence the outcome of the elections, but I will affirm that in my analysis, it does look as if there's a link with political considerations and anti-corruption.
Thank you so much, Mr. Agbaje. I'll go straight to the next question. The next question is from Lola, and she's saying, looking at the volume of currency out of the monetary system, can we then say that this inflation rate is actually artificial? And also, do we look at a reduction in this inflation rate, since all the currency in circulation will now be captured in the monetary system, like our CBN governor said? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, there is currency outside bank vaults, and there is money supply. Currency, if it goes into the banks through this exercise, will remain a part of money supply. It doesn't go out of money supply. It goes from the people who have these cash holdings, wherever they've kept them. So if they do lodge them into the banking system, it then becomes part of their current savings, fixed deposits, or other accounts in the banking system, which, to the extent that they can draw on it to consume within the economy, means it's still part of the money supply. Yeah, it could conceivably contribute towards some moderation of inflation, like I considered in my presentation. But I am not also sure that it remains to be seen. We saw the figures for other economies, 4% in Britain and 6%, and 10% in the US. So even though this appears a large part of currency, it is not a large part of money supply. And it is money supply, more precisely, that shapes inflation. In any event, as I mentioned earlier, we can think of stronger factors fueling inflation. For instance, the currency devaluation, for instance, the rate of deficit spending in the economy, insecurity, which is contributing to food inflation. So we can find rational causes of inflation, and it doesn't seem to me at this point in time that it looks as if one of the overwhelming reasons is cash outside the bank vaults. the more you examine the rationale, as I indicated in my conversation, the more you lean towards the security, the political, all of anti-corruption factors. But I am not convinced that this policy is likely to have a remarkable impact on inflation. In fact, as we've mentioned, depending on the behavior that manifests, and if that cash is really that significant and much of it is illicit money, the likelihood is that it will go into purchasing real assets rather than attempting to convert through the exchange program, which might, in the short term, at least, fuel inflation. So I concede that it's debatable, that this particular inflation argument is debatable. The arguments on both sides of the thing. What I'm a bit certain of is that the impact on inflation is not likely to be very big. And the jury is out. We've seen 1 or 2 weeks. We will see November data. And I think that it may end up having a moderate to insignificant impact on inflation.
Thank you very much, sir. I move to the next question. The next question is also from Mr. Sheson Shobowale. He mentioned that, are there any parallels, that is lessons for ordinary Nigerians and business people to be drawn between the redesign of the currency in 1984 and the current one, especially given the fact that the head of state at both periods is the same person? I recall that this 1984 redesign, what we read was, they also blocked all borders. And so nobody could even take out any money to go and change. And I think that actually was able to achieve the intention, which was, I'm sure, to curb corruption. So he's asking, is there any lessons to learn from this? Looking at it's the same Buhari and also the same Mohamed Buhari that we have as head of state.
Yes. So I carefully avoided that factor because, hey, it may just prejudice the conversation. But yes, clearly Buhari did a currency exchange in 1984 after coming in, and also is president while this, and he appears enthusiastic about the policy. You can see from his remarks that he has strongly bought into the policy. When the Minister of Finance objected, he affirmed his approval of the policy and his confidence in the outcome, and he linked it with corruption. So yes, so the mindset is the same. I do not agree that the 84 exercise achieved its objectives. I think it's similar to the 2022 episode in terms of limited time frame for exchange. We also remember the 52 suitcases issue, illustrating the fact that even when, because the 52 suitcases issue appeared to be something authorized by the regime itself, in which some emir, it was reported, returned to the country during that period with 52 suitcases, and which some people allege contained, well, suspected partly of fully contained currency, but the suitcases were never examined. So we do not know. But that illustrates the fact that the powerful, who are the ones who have resources, the powerful, the well-connected, the people who actually have significant cash in their possession, usually will have the network, the clout, the ingenuity, the links in the banking system to be able to get their cash through the banking system. And if they cannot, they typically would have other alternatives, such as dollars, such as real estate, all of those things which are tangible and preserve the value of their cash. So I agree that we can draw implications I believe that as a parting shot, it may contribute towards ameliorating inflation in the economy and to deal with corruption.
Thank you so much, sir. So I'll go to Mr. Adewale Champion. He actually took us out of this a little bit, looking at the MPC meeting that is holding today. He mentioned that would there be a likely impact if they decide to hold the rates, looking at the financial landscape and the present economic condition? Thank you.
Well, two possibilities out of MPC. They probably could increase rates or hold them. I'm not sure which one they would do, but obviously the currency redesign will be a new factor in their consideration that might incline towards holding and waiting to see the impacts that the policy may have. Also considering perhaps that there are already what I have called elements of macro uncertainty, and that therefore they may not, it may not be appropriate to introduce another layer by increasing rates or whatever. So possibly a hold with still some possibility of this. If the macro, if the currency redesign had not happened, I would have been more definitive that they were likely to continue to increase rates slightly as inflation remained a factor in their consideration.
Thank you, sir. I go to the next question. This is from Mrs. This is from Yetunde Teller. She says, good morning, Mr. Badji, and thank you for this insightful presentation. I have these comments and questions. My comment is from your second preliminary comments. CBN has control over the monetary policy only, government initiatives and processes. Fiscal policy is not in CBN control. We do not have a single exchange rate. Of course, parallel market different from bank rate, and the subsidy the government is spending 6 trillion on yearly. Until this fiscal and monetary policy are harmonized for the FX and the subsidy is removed, she believes things might not turn around, that we might just continue to be the lender of last resort exercise, like CBN keeps lending government. So a question, in your own view, how would this transition help to stabilize the FX market? Thank you, sir.
Okay, so first of all, let me examine her premises. I agree with you that my view, if you follow my flow of my conversation, we have very clear economic priorities arising from the structure of the economy. What are those priorities? As a fiscal issue, the subsidy has become a priority. Transitioning out of a fuel subsidy rate, which is corrupt, which distorts fiscal structure, which destroys the development of downstream, and which consumes scarce revenues, and then which is being abused, obviously through multiple means. So it's a priority. Harmonizing exchange rates and an end to these multiple exchange rate system is a priority. Rationalizing government spending in terms of the complexity and multiplicity of agencies and institutions, and the spending on recurrent expenditure, which is suboptimal and which does not deliver outcomes for the economy. Some additional continuation of structural economic reforms and all of that, stimulating foreign direct investment and domestic investment, indeed, so that we return to an investment-led economic growth strategy, rather than what I would describe as a borrowing-led economic growth strategy that we have adopted over the last few years. Those and others appear to me to be priorities. That's why I have I'm a bit disconnected from how did currency redesign get for our priority list in terms of dealing with the challenges we are presented with today. Having said that, how will it contribute towards FX I don't think personally that this would have any, and I think I said so in my presentation, I don't think the policy, currency redesign on its own will have any positive impact on exchange rates or FX situation. If anything, there are risks that it would have a negative impact, as we've seen, but I think that negative impact was overblown by the disequilibrium and perceptions of uncertainty and panic in the initial days. It may be a more moderated impact, but I don't see how conceivably this policy could lead to FX stability or attracting FX flows or any of those. The policy priorities in relation to FX are harmonizing the exchange rates, returning to an investment-based model such that we can re-attract foreign direct investment and portfolio flows, and improving perceptions or investor perceptions about the Nigerian economy, which we can only do through policy, through signaling that we're returning to a market-based philosophy and an investment-based philosophy.
Thank you so much, sir. I will take 2 in 1 for the next question. That's from Reverend Abata and from Mr. Kunle, because they seem to be the same. The questions are, how will the currency redesign help impact on our socio-economic development and improve condition of living for poor masses? And Mr. Kunle is saying, how will this also affect MSMEs? So basically, how will it affect the socio-economic development? How will it affect the poor masses, the woman on the street? How will it affect SMEs as well? Thank you, sir.
So let me take the MSMEs argument. If you recall, I introduced the national benefit. If we actually succeed in drawing resources into the banking system, it could improve banking sector liquidity. In theory, if our banks get more liquid, will they be inclined to increase their lending to the retail and the MSME sector? Possibly, depending on their perceptions of risk and individual bank strategy. If they do that, that's a benefit. So everybody could benefit from drawing resources into the banking system as a source of enhanced banking sector liquidity. It is conceivable that it could also reduce interest rates somewhat if those currencies do come into the system. In terms of, there's of course the consideration around transaction costs. So businesses, traders, retail businesses, MSMEs will have some transaction costs in relation to ensuring that they exchange all their funds. The average trader is selling cash on a day-to-day basis, has to factor in quickly exchanging the resources from December 15. There's a possibility that as the timeline moves towards January, even though the CBN says both will be exchangeable until the deadline, we know that popular psychology in the marketplace, people will begin to decline the old notes as the period progresses. So the average SME would be well advised to try and secure conversion of his own resources early in the process and ensure that he does not receive currency that is likely to get stuck in his hand, old currency, towards the end of the process. So yeah, it is conceivable that this could increase credit to the overall economy. We know that as a reality, the bigger companies will take most of it, but there could be some trickle-down consequences for MSMEs and retail players. Other than that, it's just a change of the currency. It does not add money to anybody. It doesn't take away money. It's an economic policy decision by the central bank.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think this second to the last is speaking to foreign currency. Mr. Gigfield believes that federal government should consider to ban schools from offering services in foreign currency because he believes this is one of the reasons why the Naira is depreciating, since there are so many FX-denominated transactions in a country where the main currency should be Naira. What's your take?
Well, it's a substantial point, but if we want to go on banning transactions in foreign currency, there are a lot of things that you have to ban. So, for instance, and I'm not advocating this, you would have to ban all these foreign currency denominated investment vehicles that the financial sector has created, Eurobond investment schemes, all of those things that allow Nigerians to invest in foreign currency. I think I would advocate not a resort to ban, but a focus on the substance. I think that with economics, you cannot get away from dealing with the substance. And the substance is your broader economic policy approach. We once had a period, not too distant memory, in which there was not an FX crisis in Nigeria. So our policy. And I think that what we need to do is first signal that we want investment, signal that we're going to run an economy based on private sector investment, based on market principles, signal towards harmonization of the multiple exchange rates, even though it may be not achievable up to perfection within the short term, but begin to move towards a very clear convergence between a range of plus or minus 5 or 10%. A very clear convergence, not the current scenario in which there's such a wide disparity between the rates. I think, of course, resolve the political transition, because I think nothing is likely to change until after the elections, because we are now in an election season. Investors will wait until the outcome. So we probably have traded off the next 6 months. And perhaps we can make some significant policy choices after the elections, but before whoever emerges as the new president is sworn. Perhaps we can take some of the difficult decisions out of the table after elections, so that we can begin to stabilize the economy in relation to subsidies, exchange rate harmonization, and some of these other difficult decisions. So I think that advocating bans gives you emotional satisfaction. It gives you the satisfaction that, yeah, we're dealing with the people. But hey, I think that the solution comes from addressing the substance. And the substance is, how do you get investments going? How do you get economic growth back in the economy? How do you get foreign flows, both of your own domestic citizens and international institutions and persons flowing back into your economy? How do you make Nigeria an attractive investment destination once again? So for me, that is where the answers will come from. I'm not so sure. You will simply, when you ban, you simply drive the thing underground, and then you will not see anything officially anymore.
Thank you so much, sir. And I would have to take the final question, because we don't expect to extend this beyond 90 minutes. The final question is from Mr. Bimbo Ajinibi. It says, looking at CBN role being currency management, which you also attested to. So a currency redesign is actually within their purview. And so it's a policy that is in place in countries, just like you also mentioned, showing that there might be downsides, there might be positive. But for Nigeria as of today, is there really a best time for this currency redesigning? And how long do you think this window should be? That's what Mr. Ajinibi wants to confirm. And that will be the last question for the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Bimbo Ajinibi. I think, well, is there a best time? I mean, we've announced the policy. It will now have more costs if we withdraw. Left to me, if I had been privy to the policy design before its announcement, I would have strongly argued that this was an inappropriate time, clearly. At the very least, I would have wanted elections to be over and possibly the concept of a notion of a census, which the government still argues will happen in April, to be over. I may even want a new government in place. The central bank is not a political institution. It does not depend on the presidency of anybody. So if the CBN is convinced that currency change is imperative, it could happen in June 2023 or August 2023 after a new president is in place. I'm personally not convinced that this was the appropriate time, and I think I gave my reasons. It adds another layer of uncertainty to a very uncertain period. And we can see the manifestations of that perception of uncertainty and risk in the volatility that has happened around exchange rates and other factors. So, but now that we've announced it, I mean, sometimes the deed is done. If you now revoke it, you do even add more instability. So perhaps the only other things we could do now, and I would not be objecting to that possibility, is that we extend the time for the change. I don't see the rationale for a 6-week period. I would even not be uncomfortable with a much longer time frame for exchanging, up to 3 months, 6 months, and so on. And a process that allows legitimate money that has not been exchanged to get into the banking system, subject to some verification, such that we do not destroy wealth in the process of exchanging currency. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Agbaje. And once again, let me appreciate everyone that has stayed with us on this call. We thank you all for joining. And like we know, it is an interesting topic for all of us about this redesign. But from what we have had today, we are not so certain of the positive effect it would have. There was a write-up by that we read, that from Mr. Mogalu, and by the time he explained that it was a policy that was needed, he spoke about the operationalization. He also spoke about the cost of the exercise. He ended it by saying that we all should hope on the intentions of the CBN and pray for the success. So just like we have said today, yes, they've rolled out reasons why this should happen. The major reason we all can just, tie it to is maybe it's really to wrap up the currency out of circulation with this regime before they hand over to the next regime. But how would that speak to our purchasing power? We leave that with the intention of CBN, and we pray that, they work in good faith with the citizens. So on this note, I would once again want to appreciate all of us for joining this session. We are already sharing our social media platform. Like we said, Apel is an integrated financial service. So when you think of finance, you think of investment, you think of will, you think of share registration, you think of investor relations. Please give us a call, follow us on our social media handle. Please visit our website as well. We are happy to even take this conversation further. And to Mr. Kwemi Agbaje, once again, we say a big thank you for entertaining us with these facts that a lot of us have not considered before now. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the detailed explanation. We appreciate that you were able to squeeze us in even within a short time. And so thank you so much, sir. And on this note, I would want to say bye-bye to every one of us. We hope that you enjoyed the rest of your day, and more importantly, happy Christmas, because our next session will be in the new year. So let us wish you a happy new year and Merry Christmas in advance. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye for now. Thank you.